This is a summary of my experience exploring how to apply BYU Ames learning outcomes in my course, PWS 100 Living with Plants. When I first started considering how to incorporate the BYU Ames into my course, I decided to color code my learning outcomes to see how they aligned. Thinking about including the Ames was new for me, but I'd had a lot of good practice writing intellectually enlarging learning outcomes, so I started there. On my learning outcome table, I color-coded intellectually enlarging green. After highlighting each learning outcome, I had so much green. For example, I have an activity called I See, I Think, I Wonder. The learning outcomes for this activity are students will integrate relevant background knowledge, observational data, and critical thinking skills to formulate hypotheses. And students will design a controlled study and identify the explanatory and dependent variables. Here's how the activity works. I tell my students a story about my husband and oldest son visiting the Lytle Preserve, a BYU-owned area located at the confluence of the Mojave, Great Basin, and Colorado Plateau. While walking in the desert, my son noticed an interesting pattern. I then show the students pictures of the insects, a number of different kinds impaled on yucca spines. One picture after another of grasshoppers, spiders, beetles, and moths all stabbed on plants in the desert. Next, I ask the students to turn to their neighbor and describe only what they observe in the images I show them. This is the I see part of the activity, where students practice careful observation. Afterward, we move to the I think part. I prompt them with the question, based on your observations, what plausible hypothesis can you create? The students then work in pairs to develop their hypotheses, which they later share with the class. Some of their ideas might include, maybe the wind blows the insects into the yucca spines, or perhaps the plant is luring insects with flowers, or maybe the yucca leaves funnel nitrogen from decomposing organisms to the plant roots. I ask the students to note their favorite hypothesis, and then I provide additional data. I then show them a picture of a shrike bird, which, as it turns out, is impaling the insects and other organisms at the Lytle Preserve. Finally, I ask the students to create a new hypothesis, taking into account the idea that organisms have adaptations for survival and reproduction. I prompt them with, how does the shrike's adaptation function? They work in pairs again, then share their thoughts with the class. The hypotheses are often creative, such as, it's a food storage strategy, or it's a fishing technique, or it's a way for the shrike to impress a mate, the will you marry me hypothesis. While reviewing my learning outcomes, I realize that this activity not only addresses cognitive learning goals, but also sparks other dimensions of student growth that fall into the affective domain, otherwise known as value system development. Curiosity is an affective attribute that I want my students to value and act on, eventually to incorporate it into their character. But this learning outcome is not necessarily spelled out on my list. To perceive the development of this attribute, I may ask my students, if you saw a shrike in the future, would you stop and observe it to learn more? Or would you share this experience with someone else? Furthermore, I might ask them, do you think you could find patterns in other areas of your life, like spiritual matters? Could you create hypotheses and test those spiritual patterns? This line of thinking led me to realize that I can create additional learning outcomes focused on helping my students develop curiosity and the ability to recognize and test patterns not just in science, but in spiritual contexts as well. This aligns with the BYU Ames goal of promoting lifelong learning and being spiritually strengthening. A potential lifelong learning outcome in this context might be, students will foster a lifelong curiosity in the natural world by continually observing and making hypotheses about the world around them. A spiritually strengthening learning outcome might be, students will recognize, hypothesize, test, and describe patterns in the natural world and in eternal principles and truths. Hooray, my learning outcomes are not just green anymore. Because I've defined these learning outcomes and I remind myself of them in my class prep, I can follow up with my students and say something like, my goal for you is to be curious and seek patterns through your whole life. This is a skill that extends beyond just understanding nature. It can also apply to eternal patterns and truths. For example, this morning, I saw a pattern when reading 3 Nephi 17. Now, I want you to turn to your neighbor and share a spiritual pattern you have seen in your life or in the scriptures that you have tested and found to hold true. These new learning outcomes help me focus not only on the powerful biology content, but also on the affective or value system outcomes I want for my students. I'm excited to keep brainstorming my course AIMS learning outcomes. Perhaps that is the affective outcome of this experience for me as an instructor.